Sulla, leading his army from Athens, joined forces with Hortensius in Boeotia. They met at a place called Philoboetis. Sulla's strategic movement allowed him to secure his supplies and take advantage of the terrain, as they had ample wood and water, and could easily guard the roads leading into the Sicily. Sulla aimed to dictate the time and location of the upcoming battle. Taxiles and his large force had to pass through a narrow defile and then enter a narrower valley between Orchomenos and Chaeronea to meet up with Archelaus and his forces. As a result of this route, once Taxiles and his forces arrived in the valley, they were unable to retreat and were compelled to stand and fight. The camp was strategically positioned in the valley, allowing the commanders to observe the Roman army. Archelaus planned to engage in a war of attrition, relying on his larger force to wear down the Romans over time. However, Taxiles, despite having a much larger force, was determined to defeat the Romans in a direct battle and insisted on engaging with them. Given the circumstances and the positioning of the forces, Archelaus had no choice but to agree to Taxiles' demand for battle. The Pontic forces, who were encamped in the valley, sent out foraging parties that plundered and burned the surrounding countryside. Sulla's smaller force was unable to defend against these raids, so they camped on a hill instead. Sulla decided to keep his soldiers occupied by having them dig entrenchments on the flanks to protect against cavalry attacks and construct palisades in the front to defend against chariots. This served two purposes: to maintain discipline among his troops and to tire them out, making them more eager for battle. When his soldiers approached him requesting to engage in battle, Sulla challenged them, suggesting that their newfound willingness to fight was a result of their laziness to work and occupy the hill of First Amy. The soldiers agreed to the task, and both Archelaus and Sulla's men raced to occupy the position first. According to Baker, this position was described as almost impregnable.
I will speak honestly. For as soldiers of mine, you deserve honesty. I want and need you to fight as though the Furies themselves were your leaders. We will shock the enemy into defeat. To arms!
Sulla commanded an army of approximately 30,000 soldiers, as estimated by historical sources. Among these, it is noted by Baker that less than 17,000 were Romans, while the remainder consisted of Macedonian and Greek allies. The exact number of Macedonian and Greek soldiers in the battle is not specified by Baker, but it is mentioned that there was a significant disparity of over 3-to-1 between the Roman forces and the Pontic troops when accounting for the allies. The Roman forces were primarily comprised of experienced Roman legions, which were known for their disciplined and well-trained soldiers. They also had a contingent of cavalry to support their infantry. The presence of Macedonian and Greek allies in Sulla's army indicates a broader coalition of forces, potentially including troops from various city-states or kingdoms in the region.
Stand ready, you dogs! I will not have you bringing shame upon me or our people this day. We will have victory or an honorable death. I swear by the gods, I will not suffer cowardice. Victory or death.
Taxiles, one of Mithridates' generals, led a significant force to join Archelaus and his army in the Elysian plains. Pontic Army was estimated to outnumber the Roman troops by a ratio of 5-to-1, reaching approximately 85,000 soldiers. However, there are conflicting accounts and uncertainties regarding the exact size of the Pontic Army. Delbruck provides two figures for the Pontic Army: a supposed number of 120,000 troops and a reduced estimate of a more modest 60,000 Asiatics. Historians of the time, such as Plutarch, relied on these memoirs as their primary source of information. Hammond, however, supports the figure of 60,000 soldiers, which is based on the account provided by Memnon of Heraclea. Mithridates' armies were a combination of Greek and Oriental elements. The infantry consisted of Macedonian-style phalanxes, with Pontic phalangists serving as missile units. The cavalry comprised both horsemen and scythe-wheeled chariots. The Pontic forces were reported to possess 90 scythe chariots, which were formidable and intimidating weapons on the battlefield. Overall, Mithridates' forces represented a diverse composition of troops from different regions and cultures, with a combination of Greek and Oriental elements. This mixture of infantry, cavalry, and chariots aimed to provide a versatile and formidable military force against the Roman army led by Sulla. In the Roman army, Sulla assumed command of the right flank, while the left flank was led by the legate Murena. The reserve cohorts were under the command of Hortensius and Galba, Hortensius positioned on the left and Galba on the right in the rear. Additionally, Gabinius and a full legion were assigned the task of occupying the town of Chaeronea. On the other side, Archelaus held the command for Mithridates' forces. As one of Mithridates' generals, Archelaus played a crucial role in leading and coordinating the Pontic army against the Romans. Before the Second Battle of Chaeronea in the spring of 86 BC, there was uncertainty on both sides. While Sulla was preparing for battle, Archelaus, the Pontic general, was not yet convinced that Sulla was truly committed to engaging in a serious confrontation. The initial skirmishes that took place seemed like a continuation of the minor clashes that had occurred over the preceding 2 weeks. However, what Archelaus did not realize at the time was that these skirmishes would escalate into the Second Battle of Chaeronea. The battle commenced with fighting around Mount Thurium. Local Chaeroneans approached Sulla, offering their knowledge of the terrain to help outmaneuver the Pontic forces stationed on the mountain. They were aware of a hidden path high above Archelaus' camp that could be used to surprise the enemy. Their plan involved launching a raid from this trail, pelting the enemy tents with stones and causing chaos, forcing the Pontic army to leave their encampment in disarray. Sulla agreed to this strategy. As the raiders set off on their mission, Sulla himself moved his forces to occupy a broad meadow with a slope that provided a strategic advantage. The plan was to force Archelaus to hastily gather his troops on uneven ground, surrounded by boulders and rocky outcrops, limiting their ability to maneuver or retreat. The surprise attack proved successful as boulders came crashing down upon the unsuspecting Pontic army. Caught off guard, the Pontic soldiers were crowded together and stumbled in confusion, with some even falling on their own spears. Taking advantage of the chaos, the attackers swiftly descended from their positions and proceeded to eliminate a significant number of Pontic soldiers, estimated to be around 3,000. The surviving Pontic troops, overcome with fear and panic, rushed down to the lower main camp, exacerbating the atmosphere of terror and disorder. Recognizing this opportune moment, Sulla seized the chance and immediately led a charge against Archelaus' disorganized army. The numerical advantage that Archelaus initially possessed was negated during the battle. Shouted commands in various languages filled the air as Archelaus deployed his cavalry to counter Sulla's attack. However, the Pontic horsemen were driven back and forced onto the rocky terrain. With desperation setting in, Archelaus resorted to a strategy he had used successfully in the past, launching 60 scythe chariots to unleash a devastating charge against Sulla's legions. The aim was to recreate the shock and chaos that had routed Nicomedes' forces in 89 BCE. Unfortunately for Archelaus, the conditions were far from ideal. War chariots required a long, smooth surface for a successful charge, a disordered target, and the element of surprise in the confined and rocky battleground. The chariots struggled to gather enough speed, and their approach was clearly visible to everyone. Plutarch recounts that the Romans responded with laughter and simply stepped aside, mimicking the evasive maneuvers used by Alexander the Great's army in 331 BCE. As the scythes of the chariots whirled impotently through the empty air, the openings created by the Romans allowed them to pass harmlessly through. The chariot drivers were swiftly cut down by the javelins of Sulla's rearguard. Amused by the spectacle, the Romans applauded uproariously and even called for more chariots, as if they were spectators at the circus races in Rome. As Sulla's forces continued their advance, Archelaus regrouped his remaining men in the rugged cliffs. The Pontic army formed a resolute line, locking their shields together and extending their spears before them. To the astonishment of the Romans, they discovered that Archelaus had positioned 15,000 Roman slaves at the front lines. These former slaves, liberated by Mithridates' proclamations since 88 BC, were likely identifiable by their slave tattoos and a distinct standard, enraged and filled with contempt. The Roman soldiers cast aside their javelins and drew their short swords, ready to cut through the ranks of these lowly slaves to reach the real enemy soldiers. The former slaves, aware that victory or crucifixion were their only options, fought with extraordinary fervor. Plutarch described how these dense ranks of freed slaves, seething with hatred towards all things Roman, displayed tremendous courage and composure in the face of intense pressure. The former slaves held their ground for a significant amount of time. Meanwhile, The Romans made use of lighter artillery pieces that remained from the siege of Athens. Positioned on slightly higher ground, they launched various projectiles, including fiery bolts, over the heads of their own troops and into the Pontic phalanx. However, due to the confined space at the end of the valley, the Pontic soldiers were drawn up in a deep formation, and the effectiveness of the artillery was somewhat reduced. The soldiers in the rear ranks positioned their 16-foot spears at an upward angle, creating a barrier that deflected arrows and lessened the impact of heavier projectiles. Eventually, the freed Roman slaves were forced to retreat under the barrage of firebolts and javelins unleashed by Sulla's rear guard. The combined assault of artillery and the relentless pressure from Sulla's forces proved too much for them. Despite facing initial challenges, Archelaus had managed to execute a classic Hellenistic battle plan. His phalanx successfully engaged the main block of enemy infantry, effectively pinning them down. Now, it was time for Archelaus to emulate Alexander the Great by deploying his superior cavalry to sweep around the flanks. His objective was to neutralize the enemy reserves and bring the battle to a decisive climax by launching a devastating attack from the rear, smashing the main Roman force against the phalanx. However, Sulla was well versed in the tactics of Alexander the Great and had taken precautions to counter such a maneuver. He had deliberately chosen flanks that were unfavorable for sweeping cavalry movements, utilizing the side of a mountain and a river to limit the effectiveness of the Pontic cavalry's encirclement. Furthermore, a Roman cohort was not equivalent to a phalanx. When confronted with mounted opposition, Roman soldiers could quickly form tight defensive formations known as hedgehog formations, which rendered the swirling attacks of cavalry relatively ineffective. Archelaus focused his initial attack on Murina's corps, which was still in a state of disarray after pursuing the routed troops from the mountain. Recognizing the danger, Hortensius swiftly descended the slope with 5 cohorts, intending to flank the Pontic cavalry. However, Hortensius underestimated the remarkable control and discipline of the Pontic cavalry, who quickly changed direction and struck Hortensius's men in the midst of their charge. Nevertheless, Hortensius's troops managed to halt and brace themselves for the impact. This sudden development left Archelaus vulnerable to a counterattack from Murina's forces. However, Murina's soldiers were occupied with the task of reforming their ranks, and their attention was soon diverted as Taxiles and his bronze shield pikemen approached to join the battle. Thus, at that moment, Hortensius found himself isolated and facing the enemy alone. As the situation on the left flank grew increasingly dire, Sulla, positioned on the river flank, recognized the urgency of the situation. He withdrew some of his available forces from the battle line and swiftly moved to address the unfolding crisis. Meanwhile, Hortensius's infantry formations had managed to maintain their cohesion in the face of Archelaus's charge and were contemplating a counterattack. Acknowledging that infantry generally holds an advantage over cavalry in a static situation, Archelaus decided to pull back in response to Sulla's reinforcement. He sought to exploit the weakened Roman right wing instead. A race ensued as both sides hurried to the river flank. Sulla directed Hortensius to join forces with Murina to repel the bronze shield pikemen, while Sulla himself led his reserves across the rear of the main battle line to confront Archelaus once again on the Roman right. For the first time in the battle, the superior numbers of the Pontic forces worked against Archelaus. He had to maneuver his cavalry around the bulk of his army, reform their ranks, and launch an attack against Sulla's right wing. However, before he could achieve this, Sulla's right wing launched a fierce assault against him. Archelaus found himself trying to steady his troops, who were reeling under the impact of the Roman assault. Despite his efforts, the Pontic forces eventually fell back in disorder toward the gap between the river and Mount Acontium. It was in this location that Archelaus had fortified his camp, anticipating that it would prevent the Romans from escaping the valley. Under the protection of his camp's ramparts, Archelaus commanded his men to stand their ground and fight. Despite the overwhelming odds, it is a testament to Archelaus's personal charisma and the discipline of the Pontic forces that they bravely attempted to hold their position. However, the Romans pursued them relentlessly, leaving little time for the Pontic forces to regroup. In the midst of the confusion and tightly packed ranks, the Pontic soldiers stood little chance against the advancing wall of Romans, who steadily closed in on them. Satisfied that the situation on the river flank was under control, Sulla made a third traversal across the rear of his battle line to assess Murina's progress. Upon arrival, he was greeted by the gratifying sight of Taxiles' bronze shield pikemen was retreating from battlefield, with both the left and right flanks crumbling. The phalanx was left vulnerable and had little chance of withstanding the Roman onslaught. Although the multiple ranks of spears in the phalanx made it nearly invincible from the front, the Romans, experienced in battling similarly armed Macedonian forces, knew that the phalangites despised being attacked from the sides and rear. The sheer mass of spears made it difficult for the phalanx to pivot and fight effectively in those directions, leaving them vulnerable to the legionaries. As a result, the phalanx began to crumble, and panic spread among the men as they desperately sought safety with Etamp. However, the guards at the gates were hesitant to grant entry without specific orders, and Archelaus, in his fervent insistence on fighting to the last, hindered any orderly retreat. Archelaus made desperate attempts to rally his troops, but the limited space available prevented any meaningful regrouping. The victorious Romans, filled with jubilation, crushed the fleeing Pontic soldiers against the rocky terrain, with ruthless hacking and stabbing. Sulla's men systematically demolished the enemy ranks, overwhelming them in the final stages of the battle. When it became evident even to Archelaus that the battle was lost, the gates of the Pontic camp were opened. However, it was a belated decision by Archelaus, as the Romans swiftly entered the camp in pursuit of the retreating enemy. Once inside, the Romans completely routed the Pontic forces. The slaughter did not cease even when the remaining remnants of the Pontic army managed to escape through the narrow passage at the end of the valley, while a phalangite, having discarded their heavy equipment, could outpace a legionary. Sulla's cavalry had emerged from the battle unscathed. They took advantage of the relatively open terrain and the vulnerable, fleeing enemy. The Pontic troops could find safety only in the far northeastern city of Chalcis in Euboea. Those who were able to evacuate from the Greek mainland, totaling around 10,000 men, were transported there by the Pontic navy. This was a significantly reduced number from the original estimate of the Pontic army, which had been approximately 120,000 strong. After the battle, Sulla commemorated his victory by erecting two trophies. One on the plain near the Mullos, where Archelaus's forces were defeated, and another on Mount Thurium to mark the expulsion of the Pontic garrison by Homoloiacus and Anaxidamus. This decisive defeat of Mithridates' forces led to a significant decrease in his allies in Greece. The Hellenic cities, witnessing Sulla's triumph, lost hope in their ability to challenge the powerful Roman Republic. Furthermore, rebellions broke out in Asia Minor against the rule of King Mithridates. Another Roman army, under the command of Fimbria, achieved further victories against the Pontic troops, compelling Mithridates to accept the terms of a truce. Sulla, engaged in internal political struggles, was also inclined towards a ceasefire. The resulting treaty marked the end of the war, with Rome regaining its province of Asia. Mithridates was forced to pay a substantial tribute of 3,000 talents, surrender 80 ships, and relinquish the previously captured provinces, retaining only his father's inherited lands. However, these limitations did not weaken his military strength, and Pontus did not become a subordinate ally of Rome. The treaty represented a compromise that left the question of future Pontic-Roman relations unresolved, and hostilities could resume in the future. The battles fought by Sulla demonstrate the multifaceted nature of Rome's elite and strength of the Roman Empire, which remained relentless even during periods of internal civil war. Despite the bloody conflicts within Italy and Rome during the first half of the 1st century BC, Roman leaders did not neglect their foreign policy activities. They were willing to allocate significant financial and military resources to protect the interests of the empire on its borders. Despite the internal divisions and conflicts, the Romans maintained a powerful army capable of resolving conflicts in the Hellenistic East.